views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
This segment of Art and About with Danny Haubin on BronxNet brings us to the far reaches of the Northwest Bronx and to the home and studio of Paula Nadelstern, and who's a wonderful quilt artist tucked away here, and we're going to get some insight into her world and her creative process. So Paula, tell us about your life here in Amalgamated and about your work.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I grew up on this same block. I've lived in the Amalgamated my entire life. We're actually 3 generations on the same block because my mother-in-law and my daughter also live not too far away. So, and I started making quilts when I was a stay-at-home mom. My previous career was as an occupational therapist for the school systems, for the public school. And I was making quilts on my kitchen table, which is the same kitchen table we have now in the same apartment. So I used to have a little sewing machine called a featherweight, and it wasn't until one of my aunts, Lottie Barth, she found a little featherweight, which is now a very coveted kind of machine. It's very small, for $25 at a yard sale, and gave it to me, and that's the machine that I worked with for over 20 years.
How old were you at that time?
I was about 15, 16,
Oh, wow.
And I took it to college with me, SUNY at Old Westbury, the first year it opened up, and I cut all my clothes, ripped my clothes up into 10-inch squares, sewed them back together, and called it a quilt. So me and that featherweight started at the first 20 quilts out of the 41 quilts I've worked on in my Kaleidoscope series.
So, and you have been working with fabric material and creating these extraordinary artworks for all this time?
As I said, I made my first quilt in probably that was about 1968. The quilt renaissance started a little bit later, but I was ready for it. I was there. The quilt renaissance really is labeled as either beginning from the bicentennial, when many little towns around America and many women's magazines were showing pictures of quilts to commemorate the bicentennial, or people went to see the Whitney Museum in the late or mid-70s when they hung Amish quilts on the wall for the first time, and people really thought of quilting as an art. And I was in the 60s doing every craft possible. I was already embroidering and everything to do with textiles, embroidering and doing macrame and doing it all. But I kept coming back to quilting because I just love the fabric so much. And it wasn't until the 80s when I asked another mom on the park bench in Van Cortlandt Park, who was, if she wanted to write a book with me. First, actually, I asked the moms on the park bench if they wanted to do a quilt with me, a group quilt, to raise money for the Amalgamated Nursery School, which my daughter was at, and which I was, I guess that was actually the 70s, not the 80s. And we started a tradition of doing group quilts. And most of these women weren't sewists. They were, by the way, the word sewer is no longer used because that sounds like a sewer, and we are no longer sewers, we are now sewists, so the quilt magazines. And so I asked the other moms on the bench, some of whom are still my good friends, if they wanted to do a quilt for the Amalgamated Nursery School. And in spite of the fact that they didn't sew, they helped me out, and that started a tradition of making quilts for the nursery school that I believe they still do to this day.
Wow.
And then after a few years, I was doing group quilts with other Bronx groups and had enough quilts. I asked another mom on the park bench, Linnell Hancock, who was a great writer, if she would like to do a book together. And we wrote a book together that was at 86 called Quilting Together, about how to do group quilts. And we communicated with a lot of quilt guilds and quilt people all around the United States.
So here, you are carrying on sort of a legacy, part of the legacy of the Amalgamated, which is, a place that has always cultivated culture. In all kinds of ways, with the art committee and the artist studios and the Beaux-Arts ball fundraiser that they used to do, and there used to be a number of the WPA period artists living here, whose whole.
And they're the ones who all knew my aunt, who was not living in Amalgamated, but helped my parents get that first apartment here.
So just even if it's in subtle ways, that the kind of energy of creativity.
Well, it felt very natural to do this here. And like, of course, we would do an art project, and of course, we would quilt or we would do something like that. It didn't ever feel like we needed to ask permission or that. I mean, everyone really literally just jumped in. It was quite wonderful. Then around that same time, I found this beautiful piece of fabric that had really been engraved in the late 1800s called Liberty of London on Central Avenue. And but that fabric, finding that beautiful piece of Liberty, is what really started my kaleidoscopes, and had this feeling that if I cut it into equal triangles, 8 equal triangles, that I would get an effect that I thought might be kaleidoscopic. And what I'm now remembering is that I did eventually buy that fabric. I did eventually, I actually ended up doing some work for Liberty of London and selling pieces that sold to the Rockefeller Center store. And because I did one quilt with it, and those techniques that I developed at that point to be able to use as much fabric as possible in one small space are still the techniques that I use and the ones that I teach and travel around the world. And since that point, I have been working on kaleidoscopes and making quilts that are kaleidoscopes. Buying that piece of fabric has really taken me around the world.
So did you have any formal artistic training before you were working with fabric?
No, I actually, as I said, I went to SUNY to be an occupational therapist, State University of New York, at Downstate Medical Center, and worked as an OT for quite a few years. And I think that the biggest gift I've ever given myself that I didn't understand, because I didn't come out of an art background, was that I started to work in a series. I didn't realize what that was going to mean, that one idea would lead to the next. And then if someone asks me how long does it take to make a quilt, I always say my whole life, because I can't work on number 41 without all the ideas that came previously. So it'd be unfair to say, even though it really is taking 2 years to make it.
But like me, you are also sort of a product of the 60s and of the psychedelic era.
I call them complex designs, or a lot of it has to do with that bilateral symmetry, and the fact that I wanted to look kaleidoscopic. So I've always kind of been there, even though that hasn't necessarily been in style. I mean, when I first started making quilts, it looked like you were supposed to make a quilt from 3 fabrics, and I made them from as many as I could get my hands on, and then I thought eventually I'll become a real quilter and make something out of, just a couple of fabrics. So it's really the kaleidoscope influence that probably does look psychedelic, but it's the idea that I'm trying to make it look like it's not contrived. Like in a second it's spontaneous, in a second it's going to be moving, there's surprise and chance. And I rely on the multiplicity. I work in a triangle, and then I multiply that triangle multiple times. I'm not a great mathematician, but the work looks like it. Like I know a lot about math. I know that a lot of engineers take my work and take my classes, and husbands like the classes because it looks like that. But really it's all about the fact that there's 360 degrees in a circle, and I divide that by the number of pieces of pie that I would like, and I mean like apple pie, I don't mean like the mathematical pie, that I would like my design to be made up of. And then I replicate that triangle over and over again.
Well, and that points to really your work ethic, because this is very incredibly labor intensive and
But to me, it's about process.
and rigorous work.
I mean,
Yeah, no,
I agree,
well,
but I think because I'm a woman, people probably do not look at your work and say, "Oh my, you must have so much patience."
I mean, I appreciate it when people, tune into that aspect, because, I mean, you don't want the first impression of your work to be like, oh, look how much work went into that.
Well, that is actually what happens a lot with quilts, and I don't welcome that comment as much, because I would like them to look at it and see the passion and see the skill. And I feel like if what they're almost suggesting is that if they had that much patience, they could do it also. And I don't think that's the situation. I don't have patience to do anything.
It is the impact that your work had, on me and Judy when we first, discovered you through the Bronx Arts Documentary Project was, an impression that stuck with us, obviously,
Well,
and I do, retain that impression of the intensity of the colors, the meticulous patterns that you create, and it's very inspiring, and I'm
because you're coming to this as a painter, so I really appreciate this, and it's a different lens. Quilters come to this, they get judged in quilt shows, the same way you get judged at the county fair kind of thing for the meticulous, the person for your points matching, and when it becomes your quilt versus this one, it's how big or how many stitches. So that's why I'm sensitive to that term, and now I understand better.
For me, it's more not standing for less, and the rigor of being willing.
But knowing that about myself, I sort of push myself maybe sometimes to put in a little more contrast actually in the patch, and then very often what you're finding is I'm taking it out again and going back to my other aesthetic.
It's not the most forgiving medium. I always gravitate towards materials that are very forgiving, meaning you can change them very easily.
And see, I feel the same thing, in fact, because I'm in that single triangle. So if I don't like something, I'm relying on the fact that it'll work out great. I don't know what it's going to look like until the very end, and I want to be the one who makes the magic and the one who's surprised. But I understand what you're saying.
It's not as easy as grabbing the eraser or the scraper or the white paint and just going back.
And I find that complex. But that's interesting, because to me it's like your work is all about figures and reality and very figurative.
Okay. My story along those lines is my parents at age 11 wanted to take me to the Art Students League because they heard they had figure classes. And so we get to 57th Street and we're walking down the block, and my father happened to mention that the possibility that the models could be nude.
You're 11?
At age 11, I somehow was not able to process this, and I bolted.
And I used to walk with my friends in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grades from PS 95 on our designated day. I walk up to Giles Place to Ruth Brody, who was an artist who gave us our painting and classes. And I used to love it.
Well, and that points back again to this feeling of community and the way that the creative spirit sort of circulates and comes back around.
And I make it my business. I start my lecture 20 times a year in Nebraska, in France, wherever I am, talking about that I'm from the Bronx. I'm not from Brooklyn. I'm from the Bronx, and why it's called the Bronx, and how I'm proud of that.
North of Manhattan and west of the Sound, that's where you'll find me hanging around. You can keep Chelsea and Sutton and the Great White Way. The Bronx is where I wanna stay. from Fordham Road to City Isle. The folks all greet you with a smile, strolling up the concourse on a summer's day. We'll tell you why I'll never stray. 4th of July out at Orchard Beach, neath the summer sky of blue. Sunday afternoon, going through the zoo. And don't forget, we've got the Yankees too. So now you know why I'll never roam far from the place that I call home. You'll never find a better place to be. Yes, the Bronx is all right with me. BRONX, the Bronx all right with me.
Coming to you from our BronxNet studios, 4 new shows highlighting some of the best of the Bronx has to offer. We sit down with political leaders on In the District and discuss local legislation, events, and issues. See how the community and business come together with The Bronx Now on BronxNet. Nosotros features leaders from our Latino community. Meet those who are moving to make a difference in public service, business, arts, and culture. Looking for new and exciting dining experiences? Then you'll want to savor the Bronx and try new restaurants and eateries that fill the borough with delicious dishes. We have it all, so experience the Bronx in new and fresh ways on BronxNet.
So each part that you know are continually at when did you start in the center?
I had a little bit of an image of sizes on graph paper. I actually went with that. I mean, I think I mentioned before that I work with that 360 degrees. So this this is 360 degrees. That's what allows it to lie flat. And it's so funny that I'm the one who goes around teaching people that little bit of math, because I'm just not a math person at all. I can't, balance a checkbook. But here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So each of these that you see is the beginning of a 1/16, the wedge, and the wedge goes all the way out to there. The whole thing is really built to the wedges. Remember I said before that I camouflage seams, so at a certain point I understood that I was adding this. That's a straight line. That's actually a seam. When I pull that back, you see that's a seam, and that's going to be the difference between where there's the kaleidoscope. But again, I've camouflaged it, and so these are attached to the wedge coming out. Like, even though there's 16 coming out, wedges, I can't sew 16 in the center. That's something that goes back to my being a quilt maker, not a kaleidoscope maker. It's too many elements that will attach neatly, plus seam allowance. So what you can't see here is that there's a seam where this patch ends in black, If you, this is a seam, so there's only 8 little triangles. Each one of these breaks up in 2, and that's something that I figured out about 30 quilts into it. That now, you know, it becomes part of my repertoire of what I'm doing.
And then as you build out from this, that's when you're testing different possibilities and interchanging,
auditioning things and
auditioning the different.
You know. So I have other quilts where I actually understood what I was doing from, you know, conceptually, but not this one. This one is really about adding in as much pattern as possible. Like I have these pieces that I haven't even figured out yet, like how I'm gonna attach them, or whether they'll actually end up in the piece. They're a continuation really of that. I mean, if we held this like this, the pattern, the kaleidoscope would actually continue all the way around.
Okay.
We'd have to turn this one around this way. And so that's one thing but I don't want it to just be about kaleidoscope. It's not just about kaleidoscope, kaleidoscope, kaleidoscope. So whatever I do with this element, ultimately, it's not going to be completely formed. Oh, it was 1998 because I was looking out my kitchen window just as I was on my way to Montefiore. My father was very ill, and I had to make a 36-inch quilt called Yard Works, and I figured it was okay for me to look out in my backyard and make this quilt about the tulips that grow. I'm on the 9th floor and I'm looking down into the community backyard. So this is called Tulips from Tulips in the courtyard below.
It also gives a very strong feeling of looking through the density of the foliage, the trees.
It was exactly that time. You know, there I am in that very sad moment having coffee. I have to go to the hospital that day, and then all of a sudden it's like, ooh, color! I see color through the trees. And my brain, you know, that part of my brain goes someplace else. So yes, that's what I saw. Just these little tips. Now it actually is a kaleidoscope, but it's an offside kaleidoscope.
So when in handling the quilt itself, I'm feeling the density, I guess, I mean, originally I imagine that most quilts was all about
keeping you warm.
Keeping you warm.
They weren't intended for the wall at all.
So yes,
to be a quilt, it really has to have a front, a backing, and something inside that is the lining, which we call batting. And nowadays there's like lots and lots of batting companies. But originally, when the colonists first came to America, and they weren't allowed to either weave fabric because they had to purchase everything, you know, from England, from the king, and they didn't have any batting with them. They didn't expect it to be as cold as it actually turned out to be as the winter. They then took little bits of the clothing that they'd worn through and they patched it together. That's where we get the word patchwork. And that is truly an American art, patchwork. And then they put leaves inside to keep them warm. Now, if you just have leaves in the middle of something like this, they'll all fall to the bottom. So they do the quilting stitch, which holds the 3 layers, the batting, backing, and the front together. You can see a little bit of my quilting stitch here.
But wouldn't any batting sort of fall
Well, the quilting stitch goes up and down, and holds
right. But I mean, you need, no matter what's in the
that's
middle,
a quilt.
you'd need.
And interesting, that's what they call quilting or patchwork in England, and in Europe they call it quilting. We call it patchwork. And now to the point where quilts were made on the wall, quilts are made only by machine, quilts are so much. We've just evolved. But the big thing that's happened in the past 10 years is the fact that people are using quilting machines, professional quilting machines, to quilt. And these things are like 10, 12 feet long, and women are learning. They're creating cottage industry, and other quilters who are hobbyists will just make a quilt top, and they'll send their quilt out to someone else to quilt it on these machines. So they've offered, me if I'd like to have one of those machines. I've used a couple of them at quilt shows, but I always joke about them how I would never even be able to get it in my elevator. I can show you the back of this element here. Okay. It's something that I started last summer, and I just couldn't fit it into this piece. I think partly because I had, it's really sort of representing the position where the Torah was kept in the, but I finally have taken it apart and redone it, and I think it fits in, but you can see how these are all seams. All of those it's all seamed together.
The back is very beautiful also.
It took me really a very long time of mulling it over, I thought I'd just give up the piece and just start from scratch, but I'm glad I finally got it.
The scale, I mean, these are really pretty small bits.
Well, this is not, this is actually seamed together so it looks like you've got that altar shape of a curve. It's not really a piece of fabric like that. So, and this is a little element I just added. So I'm bringing in a little more orange into this piece, which is kind of a surprise, and I'll be chopping that off in the middle. And I actually have my idea for my next, which will be the 42nd. I want to get to 50 so I can use a different Roman numeral. But the 42nd, there's a really big kaleidoscope world, not as big as quilting or painting, but there are people who make kaleidoscopes. And now that Japanese have actually started making kaleidoscopes, also I've become friends with some of the Japanese kaleidoscope makers. I have spoken at the National Kaleidoscope Convention, but at that time when those little cardboard, very inexpensive kaleidoscopes came, everybody had one in their parlor. It was a parlor toy, and it just wasn't a big deal to own one of those little scopes. And they think that that until quilt makers, American women in the saw the circular patterns of a kaleidoscope, they never actually worked in a kaleidoscope pattern, and that was the real start of it.
Because there's two kinds of kaleidoscopes from my experience. There's one that has stuff in it that you juggle around and you
in the end case,
constantly
there's stuff in the end case.
And then there's others that you're seeing
projecting
the world that's being
that has
reflected.
to do actually with the mirror system.
Right.
So if it is, you have to have at least 3 mirrors to hold it together. They get taped together. Now, what you're talking about, the second thing, you'll see the image off into infinity if you have a 3-mirror system. But more, what I do in order to get a mandala shape, I'm really referencing the kaleidoscopes where one of the mirrors is taped off. Yeah, so I'm always looking for ideas. I mean, I'm thinking of these little checkerboard effect here because I was teaching in Dubai last year and got a chance to go to the mosque in Oman, which was quite amazing. And it was just in the midst of all this gorgeous pattern and tapestry and the carpet, I mean, there was this dark navy blue and white checkerboard that just was so, it let everything else like really stand out. So I like elevator doors. I have made a quilt about my pottery from Italy that I've collected over the past 20 years. I have service for 8, but I will never have room in this little apartment to serve 8 people, so I actually made a quilt called Service for 8, which, so I'm always looking for new ideas. And sometimes, about at least half the time, it is from an actual kaleidoscope.
Not only is Paula an artist, but she's an instructor. She's been producing books and teaching on cruises and in workshops around the world. And tell us, so this came out this year.
Yeah, this is called Fabricadabra, Simple Quilts, Complex Fabric. And I always do things in a complex way first, and then I simplify. So this is taking the fabrics that I've designed and that I love to use, and these elements, and it is using very traditional quilts, very, very simple quilts. Like this is a quilt that's an old American pattern, this butterfly quilt, but I've used the mirror imaging fabric. These are all straight lines. I'll show you. This is the one where you've just got this background of black and white stripe, really, and here he shows the diagram, and then just applique on those mandalas, and you can make something. And this, these are traditional kaleidoscopes. This is called the Trip Around the World, which is a traditional Amish quilt. And you just start in the center, you've just got squares, and you're sewing them on. And because I camouflage the seams, and I'm using the same motif 4 times or 8 times, using see-through template plastic, you get this really elaborate idea. So the book explains my design strategies, my sewing techniques, and just how you can make a quilt that looks very dramatic, but really with very straight, simple lines. I'm actually only sew in straight lines. I'm not someone who does curved piecing or anything like that.
So, and this book is available?
This book you can get online through the publisher, C&T Publishing. You can find it on my website, nadelstern.com. You can find the fabric, the Kismet fabric online, and also on my website. Through my website, you can always speak to me. You can always write to me. Actually, my email address is Nadelstern@AOL.com. That's very clever because that's a translation of my last name. Nadel is needle and Stern is star.
All right. Well, thank you, Paula.
Danny.
This has been a great pleasure.
Really
nice. And thank
it.
you all for joining us for another exciting episode of Art and About with Danny Halbin on BronxNet. Tune in next time.